I'm here to talk about platform engineering in private cloud. And as I'll get into, I think this is a topic I spend a lot of time on, two topics, and I don't think they always come together as much as they need to. And it's also just about platform engineering in general, but looking at if you're running it mostly completely on your own in a private cloud environment, if there's any difference. And I've had a lot of discussions over the years, whatever you want to think about the processes being. We are supporting developers. We're running a stack on our own. We would like it to work. That would be cool. And we come up with a lot of processes over the years. And I think there's a lot to be said about if platform engineering is just a marketing phenomena that's gotten legs, but I think it's actually developed into a valid, interesting evolution of practices and thinking that's worth paying attention to. So the reason this is about on private cloud is I think you'll see some hand-wavy charts. You should always be interested in the source of charts and the biases people have when they show you, but then they're also fun. When I look at a lot of the organizations that I've talked with over the years, and in general, what I see is that a tremendous amount of applications, or as older folks like me will slip into saying, workloads, a lot of it is running on private cloud, you could call it not public cloud. And so in that instance, if you are looking at supporting the applications your developers are running, your own custom applications, I think it's worth kind of cutting a lot, not cutting down, but like adding in an angle on platform engineering to help us manage all of these applications we have, many of which we use multiple times a day and kind of don't notice because they're from not so thrilling organizations like banks and governments and things like that, which we would certainly notice if they were gone. It's what I call the indoor plumbing problem. It has absolutely zero value until it breaks, in which case it has infinite value until it gets fixed. So this is me. I've worked for quite some time now as a software developer, an industry analyst. I used to live in Austin, so I did some M&A work at Dell, where you have to serve for a couple of years if you work in the tech world in Austin. Now I live in Amsterdam for quite some time. But I've been lucky over the past 10 years to talk with a lot of large organizations about how they do this kind of thing, whatever you want to call it, back to that first jokey slide, how they support the stacks and their application developers for what they use. I've gotten to write 3 books and I do some silly podcasts every week. If you're interested, as one of my friends used to say, engage with my brand. Now, next slide. So let's get to that point of private cloud being dominant, because I think it's important in considering what you do, as I've gone over. So getting a handle on how much revenue there is in private cloud is really easy because you're told that every quarter from multiple places. But thinking about where applications actually run is difficult. And I'll walk you through this 50% figure that I get to. And this is from a few months ago from the CEO of AWS. I don't know him, so I'll say Matt Garman instead of just his first name. But you can see when he's talking about it, they're larger organizations, which usually means, I don't know, 10, 20,000 employees or so, depending on how you cut it. That anywhere from, let's say, I shouldn't do math in public, but if they only have 10 to 40, then that would be 90 to 60%. Thank you. That's in private cloud. We have some co-American education system here, assurances, I think. And so that's probably, again, this is scoped down to whatever some of our largest customers is. So it's a narrow scope. But if we look at some of our analyst friends, this is my favorite one from IDC. This is great. I always like to go over this lesson. They say you're not supposed to have busy charts and things in presentations. But I say, if you want people to not really question what you're saying and have the legitimacy of a chart, that's exactly what you should do, which I will now demonstrate. But if you look at this from IDC, they call it a dedicated environment, which is a fun name. But you can start to see that it's somewhere near 50-50, depending on what you think margin of error and year over year is. But it starts to be interesting, the amount of applications, and definitely if you knock SaaS out, that should recalculate for things that we care about. But you can start to see that there's a tremendous amount of private cloud out there. Now, this is a recent one from Flexera. I gathered all of their surveys about where workloads are, and I think the Flexera report is pretty legit, their state of cloud. And you can see, again, it's 60-40-ish, going back and forth, or 50-50, whatever you may want to think about it, depending on how. This is a group that I'm sure loves charts and lots of numbers. I am not a big chart person. Sorry if I've uncharted something incorrectly here. But again, the point is you can start to see 2 things that I think are very interesting. One, the workload split is very stable, at least in my opinion. It doesn't go up and down very much. I guess it does, but in this very small range. And 2, it's really in that kind of 50, 60, 40 spread of things. Now, just as one future-looking thing, This is, who knows how this will pan out, but in the world of AI, which this is my obligatory mention, it was covered thoroughly this morning, but I think most presentations have to have this nowadays. You can see here's a survey of people saying where we want to put our AI workloads, or I did the thing us old people do, apps and running models and things like that. And you can see, again, this is just what people are saying they're going to do, which is also always a dangerous thing to do very much on. Hence a chart to put authority into it. But you can see that there's a lot of people who want to do it on premises or private cloud, which kind of makes sense. You remember that whole big data is the new oil, data gravity stuff. And as we'll get into, freaking out about privacy and things like that. I guess if I worked for like Snowflake or something, maybe I would reverse these colors and make sure the people I got to do the survey, just like we did, give us the answers that we're interested in. But there's some thoughts for you. So that's why when I think about over the years, if private cloud matters as a consideration, I don't know, this is my rough sort of way of thinking about it, right? There's a tremendous amount of it out there. And again, I want to go over that. And I like to go over that because I think I haven't done a chart on this, but I think a lot of the discussion that we have when it comes to best practices and applying things don't really focus on these applications, right? They're more case studies that you get and ways of thinking about public cloud ways of doing stuff, which is a tremendous amount of what's going on out there. But there's all the people who are not so lucky, I guess, or who aren't doing that, depending on if you think it's good or bad. So let's talk about what a platform is. I don't really like definitional stuff too much going over it, but I think it's worth going over. Another thing, if you're giving a platform engineering talk, is you have to reference this 2018 martinfowler.com blog post defining what a platform was. So I've done that. Now, I think what's more interesting is if you look at some diagrams. So here's the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. There's a great reference architecture of what a diagram is with some questionable color choices that they have. It's very Eastery, pastel-y. But if you look at this, and then of course, this is another typical interpretation of what a platform is from where I work. But this is when we talk about a platform, what we're talking about. All of these different services integrated together, hopefully, that you would need to not only run the applications that you develop on your own, but also part of it, you can see it up here. Also, there's some, essentially what would you call it? The front end that your developers have. Notably, I don't think IDEs are included in your platform stuff. I'm sure developers would be just go on a permanent strike if you tried to control the IDEs they were using and things like that. But this is the scope of what a platform is. Now, you could also call this a platform as a service, but that tends to scare people nowadays. So maybe you don't want to call it that, just do the platform. But it's essentially the same sort of thing. Now, the first thing when looking at this diagram is a lot of the discussion is about getting Kubernetes set up as a platform. And notably, if you look at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, that doesn't really show up here. And like this angle is where the Kubernetes stuff works. So it's worth thinking about, is that a platform? Now, a survey that we used to do annually, it shows that the benefits, the software development benefits you get from Kubernetes have been declining as more people have been using it. This is one way of thinking about, is that sufficient of a platform to put in place? Is it going to improve the way developers are doing things? And indeed, if you look at what some of the, the original, is Troika 3? I forget the words, but the original 3 people, or at least who are credited with doing Kubernetes stuff. One of them, who I used to work for this guy indirectly for, a month until they figured out what to do with my team over at VMware. He has this great comment from way back when, 2021, that like that whole Kubernetes thing with developers using it and messing with all that YAML, sorry about that. You weren't supposed to do that, but now you do. And I think that's a good way of thinking about, is Kubernetes for application developers? And therefore, does it make a platform? It could be a layer in the platform, the infrastructure that you have. And I've noticed this especially in private cloud, when you talk with those kind of organizations, which again are usually not tech companies, their infrastructure people very often will put Kubernetes clusters in place because the developers asked for it. And then some months later, they'll be like, but why do they not use it? What is the deal with people not actually, they said they wanted it, and now these developers, as always, don't like us and aren't using the infrastructure that we've put in place. So I think it's part of a platform, or can be if you want it to be, but it's not sufficient to just stand that up and put it in place for developers. Going back, like the obvious thing is to look at the infrastructure and think about, you need all of this stuff in your platform as well, right? That's what we're talking about when we talk about a platform or a platform as a service, but try not to use that word. So how getting to the kind of meat of it, right? What are the ways that I've seen people run a platform, the platform team that they have? What are some of the characteristics that they have? And this is very light on technical things. There's plenty of that kind of stuff, but I think the way that you run it, the way that you think about it, the way the organization is structured, how you introduce it over the years is equally important. Now, the first thing, and you've probably heard this if you've looked into platform engineering for any amount of time, especially nowadays, this term has come back in the past year or so, or 2 years, which is great, which is thinking about your platform as a product. So thinking about something as a product for people who sell software is a natural thing you do because it's your product, but you're selling it. But again, in the kind of large organizations that are running more in a private cloud mode that I talk with, the infrastructure people, the people running platforms aren't thinking of what they're doing as a platform. They're often delivering a capability or delivering to what a SL, whatever letter you want to put next to it, right? They're thinking about, I was asked to do this thing and I delivered it. Not about the kind of iterative way, this kind of cyclical way of doing product management. Now, the next thing when you have a product is, I guess, hopefully you have customers. And this is another shift that I see people in especially larger organizations needing to go through with the platform is, so if we have this platform, the platform is a product has customers. Who are our customers? And hopefully it's obvious that your developers are your customers, the application developers. So in this product management way, it becomes very important to figure out where are these developers and have I talked to them and what do they need? And is what I'm doing helping them out? Or am I just making our security and compliance people happy, but my developers are still miserable, right? They don't actually like what they're doing. So for one thing, if you're not familiar with product management, it's actually, in a good way, boring in the sense that it's well understood, documented, it's easy to figure out what to do. You can get, if you like certifications, you can go hog wild, get certified in all sorts of levels of product management, which is great, right? The last good product management book I read was called, I think, Effective Product Management. It's 5-6 years old now, but it's great. Like, it'll go over what product management is. So that's another test of how much platform engineering stuff you're doing is, do you have a product manager for your platform? And in the case that, even if you do, probably you don't, when you're thinking about those developers as your customers, and this kind of represents a lot of what platform engineering aspires to do as different from just IT service delivery. Like I said, you want to talk to the developers, ask them what they're up to. And this can be a big lift if what you're interested in is, here's our spec of things, the capabilities we need to deliver. As talked about earlier, we like to spend our time getting on a bridge or a call to diagnose things. And then we like to make sure leaders know that maybe they should lead instead of diagnose, as talked about previously. So what do you do when you want to engage with these customers? And I think asking them questions, sending them surveys, figuring out how they work, and finding what works and doesn't work well for them is what you do, is a good start. And there's all sorts of ways of going about this, questions you can ask. Here's a set that some groups that I worked with at our organization used to do. You can start with these, see if they work, come up with your own. But what these questions are doing is taking an understanding of the kind of end-to-end life cycle, if you like that word, of how software is done, what developers are doing, and asking them basically on the old Likert scale thing from 1 to 5, do you like it, right? Is it working out for what you want to do? Now, this will give you there's a couple of things, or 3 things this will give you amongst other things. One, it starts that conversation with developers. If you're not used to talking with the application developers, it gets you that feedback from product management. And 2, it gives you a good place to start, right? So this may not be the most scientific way of doing things, but in theory, if you sent out these questions and everyone answers it from 1 to 5, you could put that in I don't know if you know this operational tool, this great SRE tool, Excel, and then you could sort ascending based on, I don't know, summing up or averaging all of those answers. You probably have to do some interesting macros or pivot tables or something, or not. And maybe you could ask an AI to do it for you. But that will give you a pretty good, if crude, start for, here's the thing we should start on first, right? This is the most pressing problem across all of the developers. And here's the top 5 things that we could start trying to fix for them, right? And I think this is, again, illustrates the platform as a product approach where you could be thinking, oh, we got to stand up this infrastructure. We got to make sure this is integrated. Those security people, I don't want to go to their meetings, so we got to make them happy and on. But eventually you've got to get to, and so are developers. what do they need, right? And so having this kind of input helps keep you, I don't know, focused on what actually matters for a platform, and that is the developers doing things. Now, the third thing that I think is useful here is if you send this out, I don't know, quarterly, a lot of people talk about like survey fatigue, which I think is probably real, but also I used to be an application developer and we love telling you what we thought could be improved, or otherwise better known as complaining. And so maybe if you frame it as like a chance to express yourselves as a developer, you can get around to getting some answers to it. But quarterly is probably realistic as far as the following, that if you're sending a survey out like this out and you're continuously, I don't know if quarterly is continuously, but you're frequently getting answers to this question, in theory, because you're asking the same questions, again, I'm not a very scientific person, you can see if the work that you're doing is actually working. So if the top 5 things start to shift and get better, then the work you're doing in your platform team probably is working, right? If it's not getting better, then it's not working. And this is a vital part of product management is, did we do a good job, right? Did it solve the customer's problem? And then in a large organization, I think establishing that signal is really important because you don't have the signal that us vendors have, which is we're either making money or not. You need some other kind of feedback signal that your work with your customers, the developers, is actually working out well for you. There's this kind of feedback loop that you want to get in place. I guess there's a fourth thing that's interesting is maybe you're showing developers that you care, and that gives you a point of engaging with them, which is often useful. So this is some work I've been doing recently, is thinking about, is it wise to build or buy your platform? Now, I'm extremely biased because, as I've mentioned several times, I work at an organization who sells platforms, so you can guess what my answer is going to be. But in order to look at that, I went to look at not only our sort of analysis of this, but several other people who have published on this. And it's surprisingly difficult to get a model for thinking about how many people it takes, what the costs are for building your own platform from scratch. But roughly, here's 2 ways of thinking about it, right? So a lot of these models, when you go out and look at this, and the way that I've seen a lot of large organizations do it, is they think about what it would take to build 1 or maybe 2 layers or components of this platform box, right? So they think about, we might need people to hook up all of the middleware to like the Kubernetes part that we have, and whatever, that's, I don't know, 5, 8 people or whatever, right, that we're going to be doing. But what people find is you have all of those other layers. And so what I've seen is the amount of teams that you have expand out. You might have 3 teams or 7 teams. And this ends up being, if you're actually developing that product, right? Think about that product management cycle, asking what people need, doing that development to whether you're doing some amount of actually writing code on your own, you're just integrating things together, but you're also evolving the features that you have. You're working on that, you're owning a product, right? So this ends up being a fair amount of teams that you have. And you can see that the cumulative amount of, sorry, these are in dollars. All these studies were in dollars. And I didn't convert them looking up the salary and things like that to more euro-based ways of doing things. Anyways, you can see that the cost of this, it starts to get pretty high compared to probably other ways of doing things. And not only does it consume money, but I was talking with someone at a large bank recently, and they had this observation that their management chain was, interestingly, instead of speaking in terms of budget, they would talk in terms of headcount, which means people, us here in the room, and how many people they would need for various projects that they had to support it, which I thought was I thought I'd go back and look at how that maps to these similar sorts of numbers. And historically, if you look at some platforms that large organizations use, right? So again, think back to the number of people, 7 by 7, whatever that math is. There I am trying to do math again in public. But the amount of people that you need to build your own platform, to basically develop your own product, which, by the way, if you're interested in doing that, you should probably talk to some of those vendors. We probably pay very well and have better kind of equity plans if you like to develop products. Anyways, but you look at the amount of, if you already have a platform, the amount of staff that are typically needed to support it, and it's a lot lower than that headcount, if that's the way that your management talks. So the next couple of things that I think are very important that are often left out, and this one is especially true in large organizations, is thinking a lot more about how you do platform internal marketing. Now, if the word marketing makes you want to run out, as I used to say several years ago, throw up a little bit in your mouth, you can think of it as community management, if you like that way of thinking about it. But I'm going to say marketing because it's a lot shorter than community management. Now, as you can see, here's some pictures of large organizations over the years I've gotten the chance to talk with. And they spend a tremendous amount of time thinking about internal marketing, right? How they get the attention of the developers they want to use their platform, how they convince them that it's a good idea, how they train them, all these kind of things that you would expect from community management, which is to say marketing, right? And the whole point is that there's no value to a platform if people aren't using it, right? And the more people that are using it, the more value there is to it, which is what marketing does, right? Drives, as we would say in the subscription business, consumption of your services. So it starts with, as one of my coworkers, Deshaun, likes to say, you're going to need a t-shirt. It's one of the most vital things to start with. And then once you have a t-shirt, you got to be like, what are we going to put on it, right? And what colors is it going to be? And so it's important to think all the way up to brand. What are we going to call this thing that we have? What is the logo going to look like? What color scheme do we want to use? And you see that represented in the sample of a lot of different places. Obviously, if you're at ING, it's going to be this burnt orange color. Spread out what you have there. And Mercedes, this kind of matches or Mercedes-Benz, apologies. It matches the color scheme they have. This is one from BT, formerly British Telco, also matches their colors. And so you start to think about that right out of the gate about what's going on there as far as marketing. Now, I think the U.S. Air Force one here is particularly instructive, despite dropping bombs on people, organization. But the name of their project that they used was Kessel Run, a reference to Han Solo. And if you're like, as they say, an air person, airman or woman or whatnot, like you probably think Han Solo is pretty cool. You like planes and flying around and stuff. And it's also a little bit like renegade-y and off the normal path, which is exactly what people typically want when they're changing how they're doing software. So it's a nice kind of logo for them to bring in. And then, of course, there's this great pun, if you know the multiple meanings of AF that they put on t-shirts there, which is enjoyable. Now, this community management also includes actual, like, the internal channels that you have, setting up like places of engaging with your developers, all of that internal community management stuff you would expect. Now, I think maybe the second to last thing I'll go over that I especially see that's important in private cloud platform engineering is thinking about, I guess to put it very directly, how you justify your ongoing budget. And a lot of that has to do with talking about the value of what your platform is doing in terms that are not really technical at all, that kind of speak to people who don't really care about the technical nature of things. And instead they're like, here's another word for you. They like outcomes or value, right? So establishing early on whatever metrics you have that represent why the platform is helping the business out. How does it translate to your organization achieving the goals that they have is very important. One, so that you can report on it continuously. And two, so that you can set the baseline, the mental model for how your platform is valued, right? And if you do that at the beginning, you don't have to worry about combating or correcting incorrect ways of valuing what a platform does. You establish that from the beginning. So again, here's like a collection of metrics that I've seen over the years. So the last thing, and there's another CNCF working group that has a cloud platform maturity model, which I recommend you read if you're interested in this kind of thing, especially in large organizations, is setting expectations about how long it's going to take, the various phases of what you're doing. And this paper is pretty good for its length at giving you a sense of what the journey, as we like to say, is going to look like. And it's also good for setting those expectations on kind of a multiple year basis with those budget holders, the people who are going to determine if you still have funding, how much funding that you get, because you can set expectations, have some sort of, it's like false predictability, but have some sort of, if it was predictable, here's what it would look like, talks, if you will. And the key thing to think about here, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff. It also lists what you should do at each of these phases, what you typically do. But the main thing for large organizations, and therefore for private cloud, is if you are going to get through this journey all the way, their estimate, which matches what I've seen, is that it's going to be about 3 to 5 years or so, actual calendar years, not whatever a fiscal year is. And so that's an interesting thing to think about, is that if you're doing platform stuff, so we've got the scope of everything that a platform is, the way you're driving usage of it, that you're product managing that platform, and then finally what the kind of roadmap looks like, the kind of expected journey that you can go on. And that's I think, a good start. I think it's good because I'm presenting it. about if you're doing platform engineering in a large organization and a little bit of public cloud areas too, but especially in the private cloud. I don't know, something you can start out with. Thanks for having me and giving me some of your attention. That's the talk. Enjoy the rest of the day.